So we had you on the last book that you wrote, and I enjoyed that conversation very much. And this one works as kind of a ideal companion to that one in a
it's sort of like it's sort of an unofficial sequel is kind of what we're calling it. So the first one was the film that changed my life, and this is the best film you've never seen. So some of the same directors, a lot of new ones, some different voices in there, and it was a lot of fun. I looked back and I was like, man, it took me 10 years. It was 10 years to get all these people together.
But was that kind of the mandate that you gave them? Tell me about it could be a film that was much maligned. I mean, a lot of these films in this book were very much maligned upon their first release, or just otherwise forgotten. It
was sort of bigger than that. Like, my pitch to them was very sort of high-minded. It was like, okay, guys, let's rewrite film history. And so, let me pick a film that has either been lost or overlooked or critically savaged, and I just want you to stick up for it. So come and champion this film and help it find a new audience.
I'm wondering if there was any, I'm curious to know if filmmakers, and I don't know if you were privy to their decision process, but if filmmakers pretty much always immediately have a title in mind, like one of those movies that they cherish and take under their wing.
Yeah, almost always, actually. And a few of them, and I'm not kidding, a few of them used it as like dating material. Like, if they had this movie that was difficult or was unusual in some way, and they took a date to it, or they showed it, and that person didn't like it, then they knew that the relationship wasn't going to work out.
Yeah, I mean that is a great litmus test. I've used that somewhat myself here and there.
So what's the film you showed Dave?
Well, I mean there's a couple that are just so close to me, and if they don't get it, then they can never completely get me. I feel I mean there's some. I was actually thinking about movies that I think have been unfairly maligned or forgotten as I was reading the book, and for me, it's a fairly recent movie. It's that film, The Assassination of Richard Nixon, is a film that I just was completely blown away by, and I've never heard anyone talk about that movie.
Yeah, and you're ahead of me. And I have to admit, like in the middle of this book, I had twins, so it severely cut down on the kind of movies I watched and the amount of movies I watched. So you're adding one to my list.
Absolutely, it's like a new Taxi Driver, that movie, and I think one of the great Sean Penn performances from that film. So that's a great movie. See, only 5 minutes into the conversation, I've already written my chapter in your book.
Well, and let me add a one. No one talks about this film, but I love it. It's called State of Grace. It's another Sean Penn film.
Yeah.
It came out in 1990. I hear no one ever talk about it, and I saw it, and I was just blown away by it. And I was like, why? I don't know if it went up against another movie, and it just got buried, or what it was. But I was just blown away by it. And there's a scene between John C. Reilly and Ed Harris that I'm still haunted by. It's really, really a great film.
Yeah, I remember that scene. I think 90 was the year of Goodfellas, so all kind of mob movies felt like they paled in comparison. And
probably,
State of Grace is the Irish mob, right?
If I remember right, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great movie, and it's so incredibly stylish. And Gary Oldman, I mean, come on.
Yeah, no, it's great.
Yeah. So when you were gathering the material for this book, were there any films that completely floored you that these directors would defend?
Well, I mean, largely I let them set the criteria. Like, basically I said, I want you to, challenge me and challenge an audience. And some of them actually were Oscar-winning films. Kevin Smith picked A Man for All Seasons, and I said, well, Kevin, that doesn't really fit. Like, it actually swept the Oscars. It, won the most Oscars. And he said, yeah, but that makes it more tragic because no one ever talks about it anymore. So I kind of let him, get away with it because he was right, and he was even more pointed. He was like, no one under 30 has ever heard of that film. And then there are sort of, I don't know if you could call them camp classics, but John Waters talks about Boom, which is this Elizabeth Taylor film, and there's another film, Can't Stop the Music, which is the Village People musical that Jonathan Levine, the guy who did The Whackness and 50/50 and Warm Bodies, just remembers being, drawn to as a kid. And it is a crazy piece of film history. But I liked, the esoteric nature of just the chapter list.
It absolutely is an irresistible book. I'm not just saying that. I loved your last book, and I love this equally. But speaking of what Kevin Smith told you about Man for All Seasons, it is a sad kind of fact nowadays that the short kind of memory and the short attention span, and a lot of younger people don't consider anything that occurred before they were born to be of any value. So
it is. I think I taught film classes for a while, and I think that's just generational. I think I was like that as well. I think at a certain point in my life, in high school, it was hard to get me to watch anything that was black and white. And that was a pretty sort of low bar. But now, some of my favorite films are black and white, including Trouble in Paradise, which is actually in the book. Peter Bogdanovich led me to this. I think it's Ernst Lubitsch's finest film, and it's a beautiful, funny film that, as he points out, had it been made a few years later, they wouldn't have been able to release it because of the code. It's so sort of like saucy.
Yeah. Were there movies that were complete discoveries for you that you didn't know about in this book?
Oh, yeah. Most of them. I consider myself sort of a film geek, and, there's probably 25 films I had never seen. Like, the book led me to the film. So, yeah. That's half the fun of doing the book, is I got to watch all these weird films, and, I started this with this sort of insane idea that I would help bring them to DVD. Well, that just shows you the quick passage of time, because now DVD is sort of like falling out of favor, and on demand and that sort of stuff is changing that. But if you look, most of these films aren't on demand either. It's really, really hard to find something like La Jolie May, which is a Chris Marker film. And Chris Marker's the guy who made La Jetée, which was later, sort of adapted as 12 Monkeys.
Right.
So he's not a completely obscure guy, but try to find that thing in any place but YouTube. It's really hard.
That's why I think a lot of the titles in this book would be perfect for kind of the on-demand video, as in, I think Warner Archive does this, and a couple of other places, where they print the DVD as it's ordered. So it's kind of like an on-demand. If you ask for it, we'll print it for you. Because it's just a shame if these movies get lost and they're not readily available for people.
Well, and I had Guillermo del Toro basically tell me there's a Pupi Avati film that he loves called The Arcane Sorcerer, and he said, yeah, no, I'm sort of on this crusade to have the Criterion Collection do a disc. I want this done, and that's why I'm talking to you. So like, I sort of joined people in this crusade who had crusades of their own.
There's two movies in the book that I count among my top favorites. Mm-hmm. One of which is Fearless, which I think is the best Jeff Bridges performance that I've seen, the one that has moved me the most. And yet again, another film that isn't very much talked about. It was kind of forgotten. And the other is Fire Walk With Me, which I was delighted and surprised to find was John Dahl's recommendation. Yeah,
and John is a great guy and sort of this wonderful mind when it comes to films, and that was a guilty pleasure interview for me because I'm from Montana and he's from Montana, and we actually went to the same high school, I think 20 years apart, and David Lynch is from Montana. So there was a lot of Montana in that particular interview. And I'm not sure that I would put that in my top, 5 David Lynch films, but talking to him about it made me love the film.
It's telling that he says, essentially, you can fast forward through the first 20 minutes of it. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of true in a way. I think the first 20 minutes of it are for fans of the TV show a lot, and to kind of reinitiate them into the world. And this is the Twin Peaks that you know and love from the TV series. And then 20 minutes into it, when Laura Palmer is introduced, it's like the movie changes gears and tells you, okay, we're going to go into hell now. It plays like a horror film for me.
Oh yeah, and it is not sort of an easy sibling of the TV show. I mean, it sort of defies and plays against some of those expectations, and of course, it's much more violent, much more disturbing. And again, Laura Palmer is a 30-year-old high school student. Like, that's the other thing that's hard about it is, I think, because some roles had to be recast. It had a lot going against it. But Mulholland Drive, which I think is probably the best David Lynch film, started as a TV show. So he's had a strange relationship with TV.
Yeah. Now, did you have them? Were they all asked to submit more than one so you could choose, or did they all just pull for one?
No, usually they suggested one. Occasionally, someone would suggest two. Either like they couldn't find a print of it, or there was something in the way. And I think only once did somebody suggest a couple, and then I looked for them, or I saw them, and then I made a suggestion. For example, I'll tell you which one it was. It was Jonathan Levine. He wanted to talk about either Can't Stop the Music or The Eyes of I think it's The Eyes of Laura Mars. Yeah. And I saw it, and again, I know he loves it. I did not love it. And I remember Pauline Kael.
That was an enormous rave review that she wrote of Eyes of Laura Mars, and people gave her complete crap for that.
Yeah, I think she deserved it. I think she deserved it. And again, I'm all open to different points of view, but I saw it and I was mad at a certain point because it's one of those kind of mysteries that is all red herrings, and when you find out, finally who the serial killer is, you're so pissed off because it's so implausible. that I and it's and I realized that was part of the trick of the filmmaker. And the filmmaker was Irving Kershner. It was his film just before The Empire Strikes Back. So that was interesting to me as well, because I didn't know his career that well. But even though it didn't make it into the book, it opened me up to a new film world.
So when you watched these films that they recommended and you knew that you were going to discuss with them later, and you kind of formulated your questions, what did you want to get at? What did you want to get from your interview subject specifically?
Well, I wanted it to be provocative because, again, these are often much maligned films. So I wanted to sort of hold my interviewees to that standard and say, like, okay, you love this film. This is a film that's close to your heart. Defend it. Here's what's been said about it. Defend it. And mostly people played along. They were like, I can see this criticism, or that criticism is actually right, but it's missing the point. Or something to that effect. I like this, but not this. Or, the only interview I had really where the director did not want to play along was Henry Jaglom, when he was talking about F for Fake, which is one of my favorite Orson Welles films. And he would not hear any criticism. He was just like, no, it's a masterpiece. You don't pick apart a masterpiece. I am not going to hear any criticism of it.
And he was he was personally connected to Welles as well, so I'm sure he was very protective. Yeah,
he was Orson's friend, and Orson actually appeared in his last performance is in one of Henry's films, Someone to Love.
So you wanted to kind of play devil's advocate at times with them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was the thing, is I wanted to provoke and say, like, listen, if you love this, stick up for it. And it led to really, really lively conversations, more so actually than the first book. So it was a lot of fun to do.
So you said that you started to love Fire Walk with Me more after speaking to John Dahl. What other titles did they open your eyes to that you kind of had to re-examine and you like a lot more now?
Well, one of them is Sweet Charity. Bill Condon talks about Sweet Charity. And again, not a perfect film. And, it is caught between eras, when the big musicals were going out. But, it's Bob Fosse in his first film just trying everything. And the staging of the number Hey Big Spender is so infectious. And, like, I can think of few other magnetic, just big dance numbers that are, sexy and provocative and just memorable. So I have a soft spot for Sweet Charity. There's also weird little ones in here too, like Alex Proyas, who directed I, Robot and Dark City, loved The Swimmer, which is this really weird, little film based on a short story that I think where it was directed by the couple who did Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, is a really independent film and super hard to see. I don't think it was even released until a little while ago. Go ahead.
So a lot of these movies that are not available, that's another thing that makes this time different, because filmmakers I was talking about this earlier today, filmmakers of a certain generation before ours, they only had the opportunity to see movies in the theater, so they saw it once or they saw it multiple times depending on how much they could afford to go see it. And then the movie had to live in their memory. It's not like today where a lot of stuff is immediately available and you can study and pull from and, shot for shot. So some of these movies, I'm sure, that are not available today, they burn themselves so deeply into their memory. So I would imagine that in their testimony as to why they love it, was a lot of them must have been a very visceral, emotional kind of remembrance of these movies.
Yeah, and I've said this before, but what they're trying to do, I think, in large part, is they're kind of chasing the dragon. Like, they got a fix of this film. They were tantalized by it, or it hooked into some part of them, and they're trying to recreate that, and they're trying to turn other people on to it. So I think that is part of the allure of doing this, is you sort of get to share your love with something that, again, was just a little piece of your film history that is so personal because, you and maybe a handful of other people love this film or have been exposed to this film.
And for movie geeks, there's very few pleasures greater than opening someone's eyes to a movie they didn't know existed, and seeing that they love it as well. Kind of spreading it like that. So what are there other titles from your own personal experience that you've always wanted to? You mentioned State of Grace, but are there others that you've always wanted to kind of blow the trumpets for?
Yeah, there's a handful of films, and again, just because this book took so long, some of them have surfaced. I've been a long-time fan of this Peter Jackson film called Dead Alive, that if you're outside the U.S., it's called Brain Dead, which is just amazing. It's funny and gory and tough to stomach, actually, but I was blown away by that. There's another film that Henry Brummel directed. He's largely a TV director. He did Homicide, but he directed this film called Panic in 2000 with William H. Macy and Donald Sutherland. And I saw it and was completely blindsided by it. And I was a film critic at the time for the Chicago Tribune, and that was the only way I saw it. Like, I think it just snuck in and then snuck out of theaters. But I was just bowled over by it.
It's so odd. I have the soundtrack to that. I have the score to that. I think it was Mark Isham that did the music, but I've never seen the movie. I'm aware of that movie.
Yeah. So I would recommend that. There's another one that I think is one of the indie films. It's a mockumentary. It's called The Making of And God Spoke, and it's weird. Like, there's no one you would ever really recognize in it. It's got like Soupy Sales in it, in a cameo playing Moses, I think. But it's about this like little independent production company that wants to film the Bible, and they just fail miserably. You know, they run over budget. So like, okay, what do we have to cut? Okay, we're gonna cut the Old Testament, or we're gonna cut the New Testament, or, and the woman they cast as Eve has no one thinks to have her take off her clothes, and she's got a body length snake tattoo. Like, no one thought, so it's really great and irreverent, and sort of as a time capsule. But I have a lot of affection for that one.
And a lot of these movies too, and this might explain to a large extent why they were maligned upon first release. You mentioned Dead Alive, Fire Walk with Me, Joe versus the Volcano, I would put in this category. A lot of them are go for broke movies.
Where they create their own world, and either you're sort of, you're on the bus or you're not.
Yeah.
So, it's really you either accept their world, and Adam McGowan picks this film, The Homecoming, which is based on a Harold Pinter play that is so strange that again, you're either there or you're not, and you're either mystified or you're offended.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you see some of these movies that they cite as some of their favorites? Do you see them reflected in their own work? I mean, can you see the influence of some of these movies in these directors' works?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Richard Linklater talked to me about Some Came Running, which is this sort of, it's called the first Rat Pack film because it has Shirley MacLaine and Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin in it, but it's a really strange, not lighthearted piece. It's sort of a middle period Frank Sinatra piece, after Elvis had kind of made him irrelevant and he had to sort of reinvent himself, and he's a guy who's kind of dark. And Linklater and his love of sort of characters and ambiguity, that was really great to explore that with him. Also, just the fact that I didn't know, but he is the world's biggest Vincent Minnelli fan. And he's like, I couldn't tell you another director who who flew out to Broadway to see Minnelli on Minnelli when Liza Minnelli sang songs from her dad's films and told stories. To him, that was like a great night in his life. And for him, he basically said, if I could do anything, I want to be a studio director, and have this like long career where I do all different types of films. And he's been able to do that, but just in the indie world.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. He's one of our best. And there's also, there's a couple of directors in here that we've had the pleasure of welcoming on the show, like somebody like Neil LaBute. I spent a half hour with Neil LaBute talking about Kubrick's Barry Lyndon a year or two ago. And the movie that he chooses in your book, I think it's Bloom in Love, and that speaks kind of specifically to some of the themes that he's obsessed with in his own work. Yeah, infidelity and sort of sexual permissions and marriage and like that. It's a Paul Mazursky film, and I think we can sort of see the link between LaBute and Mazursky. But the interesting thing for me is, like, I had these conversations with Neil while he was directing The Wicker Man. Wow.
It was done in a very sort of different context, and we had these great sort of side conversations about, like, it's like, mine's not going to be a musical. I'm interested if somebody will revisit that and name that in a future book, as well. But right now it just shows up on what I consider sort of like the podcast companion to this book, which is how did this get made? I love that, and sometimes I will listen to that show without having seen the film. That's how entertaining it is.
Well, and it goes back to that kind of go for broke quality in some of these movies. I don't think upon their initial release people were quite ready for a lot of these titles, and they were pretty much made to be reassessed at a later date when we have some distance from them.
Yeah, hopefully. Hopefully.
Now, I don't know about Wicker Man, but
yeah. Well, I mean, how did that film do when it first came out? If it didn't have, somebody who was doubling for Brett Eklund naked, would people remember it? That's the other thing that's weird. It's
True.
like a mini musical. If nothing else, Neil made me go see the original Wicker Man.
Yeah. I love talking to him. So this has been like years in the making. These interviews that you've collected.
Well, getting directors together is like herding cats. So you really, if I were to do this sort of in a modern, if I had started this today, I just started as a blog, and then try to gather directors that way. And then maybe it would become a book. But it's a really interesting way, and I've been very fortunate, and the directors have been so generous. And, most of the time I did these interviews when these guys were on sets somewhere, or, they were between films, or, I was really sort of imposing on them. But they usually weren't on movie tour, because when they go on movie tour, they talk about their own film for, 12 interviews a day. But I think the chance to talk about someone else's film was so liberating for them that it provided like this great sort of, outlet. I think you probably found that with your own interviews as well.
Well, tell me what it was like to talk to Bogdanovich, because here's a guy that has known everyone and has stories for days. That must have been a big thrill. Yeah,
no, he is a wonderful raconteur. And he has, in some ways you can't help but identify with him as a young sort of like film journalist, because, there were a few journalists that are, movie writers that became filmmakers, Bogdanovich, Truffaut, and being where they were, not that I'm going to go out and make a film like The Last Picture Show, but it's interesting because they identify with you and you identify with them, and they know what is quotable, they know how to be entertaining, but they, they know what it's like to do that job from the director's chair. Yeah.
So trilogies are all the rage nowadays. Do you have an idea for kind of a third book in this series, or are you going to take it in a different direction?
I don't. This is my sixth book, and before I did the film books, I did this film called Last Words of the Executed, which is also sort of my sort of like talking books. I talk to people, or I sort of create an oral history out of something. So I've done death, I've done movies, so the next logical book is something about sex. So I've done death, I think I have to do sex. I don't know what that's going to be. So for the first time in several years, I'm not under contract, and it's a little bit liberating and a lot frightening, so we'll see.
Yeah. Well, in terms of films, I was talking about this on the show the other day. It seems to be still taboo, sex. I mean, I think we're so much more sensitive about that topic in cinema than we are violence, and probably that's unique to the U.S., but...
Yeah, well, that's an old Marlon Brando quote as well. It's something like, if you kiss a breast or you show a breast, it's an X, but if you chop it off, it's an R. Yeah. So we're squeamish about that. But I think also, and I'm misquoting him a little bit, but Scorsese talks about how just sex in a film can just ruin the momentum. It could just stop a film dead. And I think it's really, really hard to do sex on film that is actually sexy. And I think people have, I think The Onion did a list at one point, but the only one that I can think of that actually manages to sort of be erotic is Salma Hayek and Antonio Banderas in Desperado. You know, like I can't think of anything else that's sexy. Everything else looks staged, and it looks like, yeah, we've been doing this all day, and you know, we're blocking the shots, and you know, that was an interesting thing talking to Austin Chick, who is in the book. He talked about filming this little-known film with Mark Ruffalo in it called XXXY, and there's sort of this attempted threesome in it that he was like, you know, it just left everybody in tears. You know, it was not easy to shoot. It was not fun to shoot. And you know, there's two sort of philosophies about how you shoot sex scenes, and one is, you know, you're better off doing it at the beginning where everybody's sort of, you know, getting to know one another and whatnot, and you get it out of the way because your stars may end up hating one another at the end of the shoot. So it's better to get that up front. So it was interesting to think about the dynamics of when and how to shoot a sex scene.
Well, and then there's movies that are about titillation and there's a sex scene in them, and then there are movies that are truly about sex. And I think that a movie like Last Tango in Paris, that's a movie where the sex expresses something about the characters. I mean, for me it does, at least. I mean, I know some people don't like it. And I was also struck by, you know, the Cannes jury, the Cannes Film Festival jury, that just voted on the 3-hour kind of lesbian sex movie for their Palme d'Or. And that jury is led by Spielberg, who is probably the least sexual of all American filmmakers.
Yeah, I was rolling through my Rolodex. I was like, when was the last hot sex scene in a Spielberg film? And I could not think of it.
It's like he still hasn't discovered it.
Yeah. Well, and you know, there's a really interesting scene, like the most disturbing assassination in Munich attempts, like, you know, the one of the marks attempts to sort of seduce them. And I think, like, you know, I was sort of taken aback. I was like, okay, I've never seen this in a Spielberg film. You know, so I actually really like Munich. It's one of those movies that I think has sort of great moral ambiguity, and I don't think gets a lot of due.